Before the construction of the current main college building on Hoskin Avenue in 1891, and the dedication of a chapel in the space which we now today know as the Cody Library, the history of Wycliffe College's chapel life is cloudy at best. When the earliest students met for class in the schoolhouse at St. James's Cathedral in 1877, we can assume that the students attended morning prayer together. But there's no mention of in any of the college histories of what space was used for that purpose. When the college was moved to its first building on College Street, it appears from architectural drawings that there was a chapel included in the design, but we have no photographs or descriptions of the inside of this space. In the original building on College Street, for a time, the library appears to have been used for worship services. While we do not know much about the chapel which originally occupied today's Cody Library from 1891 to 1910, we do know that after a long and faithful service, it proved too small a space for a fast-growing college. In 1910, it was decided by the college council that a major overhaul of the facilities was in order, and the final architectural plans called for the purchase of the empty lot just east of the college for the construction of a new chapel. This was to be connected to the main building by an ambulatory and a new house for the principal. Financial details were finalized by late 1910. The formal architectural plans were drawn up by the renowned Canadian firm of Gordon and Helliwell, and construction began in early 1911. The name of Founders Chapel was chosen in recognition of the churchmen and women who came together to create Wycliffe College in 1877. But it was also chosen in recognition of the original founders who came together to evangelize the world in apostolic times. In 1911, as the construction began in earnest, Samuel Hume Blake, one of the original founders of the college, was responsible for organizing the planning and financing, while also serving to keep the project moving forward. The construction costs of $15,000 were borne entirely by Margaret Lewis Gooderham, a generous act commemorated by a plaque in the chapel. The laying of the foundation stone was celebrated on May 27, 1911, and the building was completed on October 10, 1911. Both dedication services were officiated by Bishop James Fielding Sweeney. Sam Blake delivered addresses at each occasion to large public gatherings, which highlighted the essential role which Founders Chapel was to serve, not just for college life, but as a central witness to all of Canada. While the impetus for the construction of Founders Chapel was the need for more space for worship for a student body grown too large for the old chapel, it was also intended to serve as a powerful statement of the planting, taking root, and growth of the evangelical faith, which Wycliffe College was to cultivate within the church in Canada. The idea that the chapel should act as a witness in brick and mortar and should evolve with the communities which worshipped within it has continually been reflected in the subsequent modifications and renovations over the past century. Originally, the interior of Founders Chapel was designed and decorated to proclaim the mediating spiritual presence of the risen Christ. Communion rails separated the congregation, seated in pews, from an apse that was dominated by a magnificent painting by the Norwegian artist Axel Ender, entitled "He is Risen," depicting an angel declaring to the disciples, "He is not here, he is risen." It was located behind and above the Lord's table, which was set against the north wall of the apse. It dominated the chapel. Its massiveness overwhelmed worshippers, especially when, with the exception of the stained glass windows, the painting provided almost all the chapel's colors. A large and elevated pulpit dominated the space on the west between the congregation and the apse, representing the centrality of the word and emphasizing the importance of preaching. This made the chapel a somber place of worship, with oak pews and furniture between bare and red brick walls, and an aisle covering of dark brown linoleum. In former times, in line with the structured life of the college, seating was assigned, with first-year students seated at the front. As they progressed in their studies, they moved back until, in their graduating year, they sat in pews just in front of the faculty stalls, where each professor had an assigned seat, with the principal occupying that on the left as one entered, and the dean of residence first on the right. This made it a crowded place, for the small chancel was filled by a pulpit, a prayer desk, choir stalls, and organ. As well, a brass rail separated a sanctuary where the Lord's table stood against the red wall under the painting. At either end of the table, large copies of the Book of Common Prayer stood on brass lecterns. By the mid-20th century, it was time for Wycliffe to adapt its chapel to a changing church. The first major renovations were carried out from 1947 to 1950. The painting was moved out, as were the choir stalls and the brass communion rail. The table was brought forward from the wall, and the two lecterns were removed. A blue carpet was laid down in the aisle and across the chancel and sanctuary. Nothing now stood between worshippers and the Lord's table. Change was spurred on by the purchase and donation of a Cassavant organ by James Nicholson. Overall, the changes provoked little or no negative comment. A floor-length wooden candlestick was placed at each end of the table. Pews were replaced by cathedral chairs, each one donated by a Wycliffe supporter. Chancel furniture was brought forward to what had been the chancel steps, so that worshippers could share in intimacy with the holy table. Pulpit and prayer book desks were removed. The lectern was placed in front of the table for reading lessons and preaching sermons. Today, Founders Chapel continues as a place of daily prayer and worship. It is a location where clergy have been ordained, bishops consecrated, missionaries commissioned. Preachers from every continent have preached to generations of future preachers here. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The memorial east windows were done by the firm of Reginald Bell of London, England, between 1936 and 1942. Bell was in the war when the fifth window was done and gave advice to Arthur Lucas, who was responsible for the McKelleran window and was associated with Bell in the design of the first four. It is to these stained glass windows in Founders Chapel that we turn now.